There's something quietly disorienting about being the first generation to grow up entirely inside two worlds at once, not moving between them, not choosing one over the other, but existing in both simultaneously from the moment your brain began forming memories. If you're Gen Z, born roughly between 1997 and 2012, your childhood wasn't pre-digital or post-digital. It was natively digital, and that distinction matters more than most people realize. You didn't adapt to technology, you developed alongside it. Your first conscious memories likely include a screen. Your sense of connection was never purely physical. Your identity didn't form in one location. It formed across platforms, group chats, and comment sections, while also forming in classrooms, bedrooms, and backyards. This wasn't a choice, it was your developmental environment. What makes Gen Z psychologically unique isn't that you use technology more. It's that your brain was shaped during a period when reality itself became layered. The physical world and the digital world weren't separate experiences. They were the same experience, happening at the same time. And your nervous system adapted to that duality in ways no generation before you ever had to. This isn't about screen time debates or social media criticism. It's about recognizing that development is shaped by environment. And the environment you grew up in trained your brain for simultaneity, hyper-awareness, and emotional transparency in ways previous generations simply cannot fully understand. That's why when older generations look at you and feel confused, it's not because you're broken. It's because you're wired for a world they only entered as adults, and you've been navigating it since, before you could read. There's a specific kind of exhaustion Gen Z carries that's hard to explain to people who didn't grow up this way. It's not just being tired, it's being aware of everything, all the time. Every headline, every crisis, every injustice, every disaster, streaming directly into your consciousness before you even finish breakfast, and it never stops. You didn't choose to be informed about every global event as it happened. It was just the air you breathed growing up. Climate crisis, school shootings, political chaos, pandemic, economic collapse, social movements, all of it, unfiltered, unmuted, arriving in real time on the same device you used to talk to your friends and do your homework. Previous generations had newspapers, television news at scheduled times, distance between themselves and the world's pain. You never had that buffer. By the time you were 13, you'd already seen more documentation of human suffering than most adults had seen in their entire lives. Not because you sought it out, but because the algorithm decided you should see it. Psychologically, this created something researchers are only beginning to understand: ambient trauma. It's not the same as direct trauma. You didn't experience these events personally, but your nervous system was constantly exposed to them. Your brain learned that danger wasn't theoretical. It was documentable, shareable, and always just one scroll away. Over time, this doesn't just create anxiety, it creates a baseline state of vigilant awareness that never fully turns off. This is why you can seem simultaneously deeply informed and emotionally drained. It's not contradiction, it's adaptation. Your brain learned to process massive amounts of information while protecting itself from complete overwhelm. You developed the ability to care about multiple crises at once, while also learning when to mute, when to step back, when to protect your own mental space. Modern conversations often frame this as fragility, as if Gen Z can't handle reality. But that's backwards. You've been handling more reality, more constantly, than any generation in history. The exhaustion isn't weakness, it's the cost of hyper-awareness. And when older generations tell you to just stop paying attention, they don't understand that your brain was trained in an environment where not paying attention wasn't an option. The world came to you, whether you were ready or not. You learn something about identity that previous generations never had to navigate, in that who you are isn't just internal, it's also external, curated, visible, and constantly being evaluated by an audience you may never meet. By the time you were a teenager, you understood that identity wasn't just something you felt, it was something you presented. You learned to craft captions, choose photos, manage your digital presence across multiple platforms, each with its own unspoken rules about what version of yourself belonged there. Instagram, you wasn't the same as TikTok you. Discord, you wasn't the same as LinkedIn you. And none of them were exactly the same as real-life you. This wasn't dishonesty, it was literacy. You understood what previous generations are only now starting to grasp, that context shapes presentation, and presentation shapes perception. You learned to code switch not just in speech, but in entire personas, moving fluidly between different versions of yourself, depending on where you were and who was watching. Psychologically, this created a unique developmental challenge. Research on identity formation shows that adolescence is when the brain consolidates a stable sense of self. But your adolescence happened in an environment where the self wasn't stable. It was multi-platformed. You had to learn who you were, while simultaneously learning how to present who you were, and those two processes were happening at the exact same time. This is why Gen Z has such a complicated relationship with authenticity. You value it intensely. You can spot performance immediately. You despise fakeness, and yet, you also understand better than anyone that authenticity itself is a type of performance. Being real online still requires choices: what to show, what to hide, how to frame vulnerability, so it connects rather than alienates. Older generations often criticize this as shallow or narcissistic, but they missed what actually happened. You didn't become more superficial, you became more sophisticated. You learned to navigate a form of selfhood that's simultaneously public and private, performed and genuine, curated and spontaneous. And while that skill may look like vanity from the outside, internally it's something far more complex. The ability to exist authentically in a world that's always watching. Friendship for you never required physical presence. Some of your closest relationships formed with people you've never met in person. You built entire support systems through screens, shared memes as emotional language, and experienced genuine intimacy in group chats and Discord servers. All EB is pad. This wasn't a substitute for real connection. It was real connection, just structured differently. You learned that proximity and closeness aren't the same thing, that you could feel understood by someone across the world while feeling completely alone in a room full of people. Geography didn't determine your people. Shared experience, humor, values, and vulnerability did. Growing up, you found your communities by interest, identity, and need, not by zip code. If you were queer in a conservative town, you found queer community online. If you loved niche hobbies, you found people who shared them. If you were struggling, you found others who understood without needing explanation. The internet wasn't a distraction from connection. For many of you, it was the first place you experienced true belonging. Psychologically, this reshaped what connection means. Studies on digital native socialization show that Gen Z experiences online relationships as emotionally legitimate, not secondary. Your brain doesn't categorize friendships as real versus online. It categorizes them as meaningful or not meaningful. And some of your most meaningful relationships happened entirely through text. But this shift came with hidden costs. When closeness doesn't require presence, it also doesn't require maintenance the same way. Friendships can fade without explanation. People can disappear by simply stopping their replies. Conflict can be avoided by muting, blocking, or ghosting. Intimacy became easier to find and easier to lose. This is why you can feel simultaneously hyper-connected and deeply lonely. You've learned to build relationships that feel real without ever requiring the vulnerability of full presence. You're skilled at emotional intimacy through language, but sometimes less practiced at intimacy through physical space, eye contact, and unscripted time together. Modern critics often frame this as isolation, but it's not that simple. You didn't lose the ability to connect, you expanded it. You just also inherited a version of connection that's more fragile, more flexible, and more dependent on continuous engagement than any generation before you ever had to manage. If there's one communication style that defines Gen Z, it's this. You rarely say what you mean directly, not because you're dishonest, but because sincerity, without irony, feels dangerously exposed. So you learn to layer meaning, to communicate through memes, sarcasm, self-deprecation, and absurdist humor that lets you express real feelings while maintaining plausible deniability. I'm fine became I'm fine, became I'm fine, lol, became I'm fine. Each layer adding distance between the feeling and the risk of being seen, feeling it. You learned that vulnerability is acceptable only when it's packaged as a joke, that caring deeply about something is safer when you also mock yourself for caring. This wasn't learned from a manual. It was learned from watching what happened to people who were sincere online. They got ridiculed, mocked, turned into memes themselves. So your generation developed a protective communication style, mean what you say, but never let anyone be completely sure you mean it. Psychologically, this is a trauma response to a specific kind of environment. Research on public vulnerability shows that when emotional expression is consistently punished or weaponized, people develop indirect communication strategies. It's not manipulation, it's self-protection. You learned that the internet has no mercy for earnestness, so you armored your sincerity and irony. This is why conversations with Gen Z can feel exhausting to older generations. They hear sarcasm and assume you don't care. But you're often saying something deeply true, just in a way that allows you to retreat if it's not received well. The irony isn't apathy, it's a safety mechanism. It lets you test whether it's safe to be real before fully committing to being real. But here's the cost over time. The armor can become hard to remove. When every feeling is reflexively wrapped in humor, it becomes difficult to access raw emotion even when you want to. You may find yourself unable to say, "I'm hurting," without immediately undercutting it. Unable to express love without adding lol jk, unless the distance that once protected you can start to isolate you, even from yourself. This doesn't mean you're emotionally unavailable. It means you're emotionally careful. You learned young that sincerity is risky, and you adapted. But adaptation isn't the same as thriving. And part of growing up for Gen Z is learning when the armor can come off, when it's safe to be earnest, and who has earned the right to see you without the layers. You came of age during a decade that felt like one long emergency. Economic recession during your childhood, school shooting drills as routine, a pandemic during your formative years, climate anxiety as background noise, political chaos as standard, social upheaval as constant. Most generations experience one or two major collective traumas. You've experienced them as a continuous state, and something specific happened to your nervous system as a result. You didn't develop the shock response. Older generations have to disruption. For you, crisis isn't abnormal. It's baseline. This is why when the world falls apart, you often seem eerily calm, not because you don't care, but because your brain has been in crisis mode so long it learned to function inside it. Psychologically, this created what researchers call continuous adaptation. When stability is never guaranteed, the nervous system stops waiting for it. Instead, it learns to operate in perpetual uncertainty. You became fluent in pivoting, in adjusting expectations, in managing disappointment as a default setting. This is why you can seem simultaneously idealistic and highly capable. You don't expect things to work out, but you've also learned to keep moving anyway. Hope for you isn't naive optimism. It's grim determination. It's the world is ending, and I still have to submit this assignment. It's dark humor, in the face of legitimate catastrophe. But this fluency came at a cost. When crisis is constant, your nervous system never fully rests. There's no recovery period, no return to baseline. You've been in fight or flight for so long that calm can actually feel destabilizing. Some of you are more comfortable in chaos than peace, because peace feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity triggers anxiety. Modern conversations often describe Gen Z as anxious, depressed, unable to cope. But that framing misses what actually happened. You're not failing to cope. You've been coping non-stop for years. The exhaustion isn't from weakness. It's from weathering things that should have been spaced out across a lifetime, not concentrated into adolescence. Your generation didn't break under pressure. You're still standing. But you're standing in a world that gave you no choice but to grow up faster than your nervous system was designed to handle. Previous generations were raised with a specific promise: work hard, follow the rules, and you'll be rewarded. Stability was achievable. Home ownership was normal. A career meant security. The system, for all its flaws, basically worked if you played by its rules. You were raised watching that promise collapse in real time. You saw your parents work multiple jobs and still struggle. You watched college become unaffordable and degrees become less valuable. You entered adulthood during a pandemic that proved institutions couldn't protect you. You witnessed wealth inequality become so extreme, it stopped feeling like something you could overcome through effort alone. And your brain adapted to a very different understanding of how the world works. You don't believe the system will take care of you. You've seen too much evidence to the contrary. So you stopped orienting your life around traditional markers of success. Home ownership, unlikely; retirement, a joke; financial security, a fantasy. Psychologically, this created a profound shift in how you approach the future. Research on economic anxiety in young adults shows that when systemic stability feels impossible, people stop planning long-term. Not because they're lazy, but because long-term planning requires belief that the future will resemble the present, and you don't have that belief. This is why hustle culture and side gigs define so much of Gen Z work life. You're not entrepreneurial because you love capitalism. You're entrepreneurial because you don't trust it. You learned young that no job is permanent, no company is loyal, and financial survival requires multiple income streams. Security isn't something you expect. It's something you have to constantly construct yourself. But this adaptation came with internal conflict. You want stability, but you don't believe in it. You want to plan for the future, but the future feels too uncertain. You want to follow traditional paths, but those paths seem designed for an economy that no longer exists. So you live in a constant state of pragmatic hopelessness, trying anyway, while not expecting it to work. This isn't nihilism, it's realism shaped by experience. And while older generations may call it pessimism, for you it's simply accurate. The system failed before you even entered it. And your generation is figuring out how to live, build, and find meaning anyway. Not because you believe things will get better, but because waiting for better isn't an option. One of the most striking differences between Gen Z and previous generations is this. You talk about your mental health the way earlier generations talked about the weather, casually, openly, without shame. I'm having a panic attack isn't a crisis announcement, it's a status update. Therapy isn't stigmatized, it's normalized. Discussing your trauma isn't oversharing, it's just sharing. This didn't happen by accident. You grew up in an era when mental health conversations shifted from taboo to mainstream. You saw public figures discuss depression, watched influencers, normalize therapy, participated in online communities where vulnerability was the currency of connection. Emotional transparency wasn't taught as a skill, it was modeled as survival. Psychologically, this created a generational norm that's almost unprecedented. Studies on emotional expression across age groups show that Gen Z self-reports mental health struggles at significantly higher rates than previous generations. Not necessarily because you experience more distress, but because you have language for it and permission to name it. This is why older generations often accuse Gen Z of being too sensitive or making everything about mental health. But that criticism misses what's actually happening. You're not more fragile, you're more articulate about internal experience. You were raised in a culture that said feelings matter, mental health is real, and suffering in silence isn't strength, it's harm. But this openness came with complications. When everyone is sharing their trauma, trauma can start to feel like identity. When mental health struggles are discussed constantly, it can become difficult to distinguish between acknowledging pain and reinforcing it. Some of you learned to perform vulnerability so well that it became hard to tell when you were actually struggling, versus when you were just describing struggle in the language your generation uses to connect. This doesn't mean your pain isn't real. It means your generation is navigating something new. How to be emotionally honest without becoming emotionally stuck. How to validate suffering without making suffering the only story. How to talk about mental health without making mental health your entire personality. And while the transparency is powerful, it's also exhausting. Not every conversation needs to be deep. Not every feeling needs to be processed publicly. Not every struggle needs to be shared. Part of maturing for Gen Z is learning that emotional transparency is a tool, not a requirement. That you can be self-aware without being self-obsessed. That sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is stop talking about how you feel and just let yourself feel it privately. There's a reason workplaces, institutions, and older generations often seem baffled by Gen Z. It's not that you're difficult, it's that you're mismatched. Your nervous system was built for a world that values transparency, flexibility, and meaning. And you're being asked to function in structures designed for a world that valued endurance, hierarchy, and loyalty. When a job expects you to stay somewhere out of obligation, but you were raised to leave situations that harm you, conflict is inevitable. When an institution demands deference to authority, but you were taught to question systems that don't serve you, tension is built in. When older people expect you to pay your dues, but you watched them pay dues for decades and still end up struggling, their advice feels irrelevant. Psychologically, this isn't defiance, it's design mismatch. Your brain was shaped in an environment where information was immediate, feedback was constant, and value was determined by impact, not tenure. You're not refusing to adapt, you're adapted to something different. And being told to just conform feels like being asked to betray the very wiring that helped you survive your formative years. This is why so many of you feel caught between worlds. You understand the game, but you don't believe in it. You can perform professionalism, but it feels like a costume. You want security, but not at the cost of your mental health, your values, or your time. And when older generations call this entitled, they're missing the actual story. You're not demanding more. You're refusing to accept less than what makes life worth living. This isn't about going back to a simpler time, how that time never existed for you. Your entire childhood was complex, layered, and uncertain, and that's not a deficit. It's your reality. The wiring you developed, the hyper-awareness, the emotional fluency, the crisis tolerance, these aren't weaknesses. They're adaptations to an environment that demanded them. You don't need to become less sensitive to survive. You don't need to abandon your transparency, your boundaries, or your refusal to accept systems that don't serve you. Those traits weren't limitations. They were necessary responses to the world you inherited, and they still carry value. Especially now, when the world needs people who can name what's broken without pretending it's fine. The work ahead isn't to outgrow your generation. It's to integrate its strengths while learning the skills it didn't teach you. To stay emotionally honest while building resilience that doesn't require constant processing. To maintain your awareness while protecting your nervous system from collapse. To hold on to your values while building the stability that makes living them sustainable. If this video helped you understand yourself a little more clearly, or put words to something you've felt for years, you're not alone here. Share your experience in the comments. And if you appreciate research-based psychological insight like this, consider subscribing. We're just getting started.